biblicalworldview.com, where you can watch all of our segments, including the one we are about to have with my good friend and colleague, David Closson, because it is time for our Worldview Friday and our Worldview segment. And we actually have two topics that we are going to tackle today, both of which I'm very excited about, but because we have limited time, we're going to run through these pretty quickly. So hang on tight. The first topic is about cancel culture. Is cancel culture actually accountability? And second, at the end of our conversation, who politicizes their faith more, progressive Christians or conservative Christians? There's actually been a study to ask that question. And joining me now to discuss it is David Closson. David, welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good to be here, Joseph.
Well, good to have you as always. Let's start with cancel culture. And before we get to the nut of the question of whether cancel culture really is about accountability or not, I'm going to ask you, when you hear the term cancel culture, what comes to mind?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is kind of a popular phrase that's been used for the last couple of years, I think. But I think when you hear cancel culture, it essentially is this movement that has really gained a lot of steam around the country, Joseph, that dissenting views, unpopular beliefs, views that are outside the mainstream, anything against kind of the prevailing zeitgeist of our culture is not only not allowed to be a part of the conversations, but is actively being pushed out. You are, quote unquote, canceling someone or some idea if it no longer agrees with the modern sensibilities or sentiments that are now popular in our culture and society.
Do you think that cancel culture is helpful because it provides accountability, or is it not helpful because it just is toxic and divides people?
Well, I think it's incredibly harmful, actually. Popular examples, Joseph, and you have a helpful piece that we now have up at frc.org/worldview. But we've been seeing different examples that we could cite, but that people are being canceled. Well known, there's Christian leaders who have views on same-sex marriage and religious liberty that are being canceled. But you give examples, even in the piece that you wrote, of cafeteria workers who are trying to celebrate Black History Month or Hispanic Heritage Month that maybe put tacos out for students to eat that are being fired because of cultural appropriation or something like that. So by and large, what I'm seeing, Joseph, in the cancel culture movement is extremely harmful because it's stifling. It might be done in the name of accountability, holding people accountable for morally right and morally praiseworthy ends. But the way it's practiced, by and large, and it's usually being practiced by those on the left, is actually stifling to free thought. It's stifling to free speech. And as a Christian, I believe at the heart of cancel culture is actually a wrong view of sin and a wrong view of redemption.
Well, one of my favorite examples, and you alluded it to there, I'll correct it a little bit, of cancel culture is Kook's Taco Truck in our favorite woke town, Portland, Oregon, also known as Portlandia, of course. And the backstory there is there were a couple of women who are Caucasian, lesser pigmented friends, and they spent some time in Central America and in the process learned how to make tortillas, I think was their specialty. They learned all these really authentic ways of making tortillas, came back to Portland. They were very excited to open up their taco truck and show the world of Portland how to make tortillas. But believe it or not, they were protested and shut down because white women, though, in fact, one of them was a quarter Asian, as I understand it. But for white women, as they were labeled, to cook and make tacos and make money selling tacos was cultural appropriation. And eventually their small business was shut down. Now, the piece that you cited in the story that I wrote this week, you can find it frc.org/worldview, also WNG.com. It's for World Opinions, where that was also published. I talk about why I think there's a difference between cancel culture and accountability. And I'm going to run through these real quickly. People can still read the article, of course, if they want to, but get your feedback on these, because there are reasons why I think cancel culture as we're experiencing it today is distinct from accountability. And we need to establish the fact that accountability is a good thing. I'm a parent. If everybody who's a parent, they want their kids to be accountable. Coaches want their kids to be accountable. Teachers want their students to be accountable. Accountability raises the standard. And in some sense, that's what the proponents of cancel culture are constantly appealing to. No, people have to be held accountable for their bad behavior, which on principle, we're all going to agree with. But does cancel culture actually do that? And here are some ways that I think we can evaluate a situation and determine whether this is an example of accountability or whether it's just an example of cancel culture. And my first key to distinguishing those is that accountability seeks to help someone. Cancel culture seeks to destroy someone. Does that make sense?
No, it does, and I think that's a helpful distinction. We are all in favor of accountability. We will all want to be held to a standard of behavior that is good and that doesn't harm other people. But what you see time and time again about this cancel culture movement, it seems more motivated by a desire for revenge, a desire to destroy people. There's no way in cancel culture, Joseph, for even someone to become reformed in their thinking. You make one sin, you commit one transgression against kind of the woke mob, and all of a sudden, not just your ideas, but you personally are vilified and need to be driven from the public square. So unlike accountability, cancel culture is really kind of driven by revenge and this animus really almost towards the person.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And for those of us who provide accountability in various ways, real accountability seeks their betterment. The reason I don't want my kids to be lazy or dishonest is because I want them to be better people. I want their life to flourish. I want them to be who God made them to be. So I hold them accountable to the things that will detract them from that. And in so much of cancel culture, we don't see people who want the better, who want to help someone else. They really do want to destroy someone else, which leads to the second point. People shouldn't be held accountable for being different. And who I have in mind when I think about this is my friend Baronel Stutzman, who's a florist in Washington State, who was kind of on the leading edge of this. I also think about Jack Phillips in Colorado, who's a baker. These are some of the kindest, sweetest people in the world, but they are being, quote unquote, held accountable because they have views about marriage and sexuality that are countercultural. Is it actually accountability when you try to destroy someone like that in their business?
No, it's not, Joseph. And I think that's why I think increasingly we're seeing cancel culture really being perpetuated and furthered. It happens on the right and left, but especially on the left. And the examples you just gave with Baronel Stutzman and Jack Phillips and others, it's increasingly orthodox Christian views on marriage, on sexuality, on God's design for how the institution of marriage is supposed to flourish. You step outside of the way the Bible defines that, especially since 2015 and the Obergefell decision that legalized same-sex marriage. Increasingly, if you dare dissent from this, the kind of the LGBT worldview, you see the culture, the cancel culture mob coming after you with a vengeance. And again, these are just orthodox views that people have held for 2,000 years, and yet because our culture has moved so quickly and so far away from biblical morality, you're seeing increasingly those of us who are just everyday Christians who are desiring to follow Jesus labeled as bigots and seen as pariahs in society. And that's where this cancel culture movement is taking us, which is why we need to push back against that.
Yeah. If you have somebody with different beliefs, you don't necessarily hold them accountable for it. You can persuade them, which is appropriate and normal and healthy in a free society. But that's not a moment where accountability steps in if they're not doing something that's actually harmful or wicked to the society. But the third point I want to make, and I'm going to do this one quickly, is that real accountability, distinct from cancel culture, holds people accountable for who they are today, not who they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And one of the worst aspects of cancel culture, in my opinion, is this instinct to go back in somebody's talk to who they went to high school with, go back through their email history from a decade ago, check their social media feed from 20 years ago, not that there was one 20 years ago, but 10 years ago, and see what horrible things by today's standards they may have said, whether they misgendered somebody or whatever new standard we have. Let's go back in time 15 years and then find them guilty for not doing that. Real accountability requires people to be good today and holds them accountable for what they're doing today, this week, not what they're doing a decade ago. Isn't that right?
You're right. And Joseph, what you just said is why, I think if we had to boil it down, why cancel culture is so pernicious. And as Christians, we should be against it, is because ultimately it has a distorted view of human nature and sin. The idea that if you've made one mistake, you are irredeemable. You can't be corrected. And as Christians, we know that all of us, we live in a Genesis 3 world. All of us are imperfect. We've all made mistakes. And there's always hope. That's what the message of the gospel is. But cancel culture would say once you've made one mistake, you've offended the modern sensibilities, you should therefore be canceled. And the gospel offers a much better way.
That's right. Next subject, David Closson, politicizing faith, progressive or conservative Christians. Who does it more? Because earlier this year, George Yancey and Ashley, I'm going to mispronounce her name, I think, Closson, published a book titled One Faith No Longer, The Transformation of Christianity in Red and Blue America. Now, Trevin Wax, a friend over at the Gospel Coalition, wrote a column on this book. He did some research that talked about the distinctions in how progressive Christians and conservative Christians see the world. What did they find?
Yeah, so it's a common caricature that theologically conservative Christians are just completely motivated by their politics. They're in bed with the Republican Party, that they conflate their politics with biblical fidelity. That's a common character. But what the authors of this book, and Trevin so helpfully highlights, is that actually those who identify as being progressive are the ones that are much more likely, Joseph, to conflate their theological beliefs with their politics. Usually that's where you'll see people talking about social justice, climate change, environmentalism, whatever it might be. But this book's really interesting, and that the idea is that these progressive Christians who are so quick to tell conservative Christians they're doing politics wrong or they're doing politics too much, they're the ones that are actually doing politics and conflating their beliefs with public policy even more so than conservative Christians.
Let me jump in here real quick. What's the distinction for the purpose of this conversation between progressive Christians and conservative Christians?
Yeah, as defined by this book, progressive Christians are ones that are defined as who don't believe in inerrancy. Inerrancy is the idea that the Bible is without error or without fault. And so that issue is important. And progressive Christians also are much more likely to say that Jesus is not the only way to salvation, whereas conservative Christians would hold to inerrancy and also, quoting John 14:6, say that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, the only way to salvation.
And some of the key findings of this research, the first is that progressive Christians are more likely to establish their identity through politics, while conservative Christians find their identity in theology. Isn't this exactly the opposite of what we've been told?
It's exactly the opposite of what we've been told, Joseph. We are increasingly told that conservative Christians, and by conservative, I mean theologically, we're defining conservative, theological conservatives, we're told are in bed with the Republican Party. They're leading on their politics. That's what's most important. We hear that we're obsessed with politics. That's all we do is talk about. And what the studies show is that actually those who are conservative theologically are spending the bulk of their time preaching the gospel, teaching the scriptures, engaging in mercy ministry. Sure, we're applying our faith to politics, but that's not what most conservative pastors are doing day in and day out. They're much more concerned with shepherding their flocks and their people than engaging in overt political activity.
The study also found that conservative Christians are more likely than progressive Christians to defy political orthodoxy. So the progressive Christians would identify with the left, generally conservative Christians with the right, generally speaking. But it is, in fact, the theologically conservative Christians who are more likely to separate from their natural political allies when their theology calls for it, because reality is for progressive Christians, they don't have a theological anchor that would cause them to separate from their political allies because they've already determined that the Bible has mistakes and can't necessarily be trusted. So they themselves are the final authority for this. But very quickly, the last thing I want to get to, David, sorry to not let you jump in there. The thing that I thought was really telling, progressive Christians are more likely to seek converts among conservative Christians than among non-Christians, which means they're more likely to convert somebody to their politics than to their faith. What does that mean?
What it means is that most progressive Christians see that they have more in common with the world. This article says more in common with atheists than they would conservative Christians. And so when it comes to making disciples, they're going to try to poach people from the conservative Christian camp because they already think they have a bunch in common with atheists and nominal Christians. So again, it shows the primacy of politics over theology.
And we have to think about what that means theologically when these, as defined by this study, progressive Christians would look at the world around them and be more motivated to reach out to and persuade people who disagree with their politics than people who have no faith in Jesus and are ultimately their eternity is not secure. And that says a lot about, I think, where they're coming from. But for all of us, I think this study should be a gut check to make sure that the hierarchy is in order. Certainly the gospel cares about ideas. Certainly politics matter because ideas matter. But if we get that order wrong, we find ourselves in a very difficult place, including trying to convert people to our politics before we try to convert them to Jesus. But David Closson, really appreciate your time with us again today.
Thank you, Joseph.